So now that we've had a look at photosynthesis and cellular respiration and their significance in living things, let's get back to that discussion about how energy flows through ecosystems. We've described photosynthesis as the gateway for new energy to enter the system of the Earth. And we know that photosynthesis is performed by plants, algae, and certain types of bacteria. These organisms are the foundation of what we call the trophic levels in a community of organisms. They are known as the producers, the autotrophs that not only self feed, but also supply the energy for other organisms in the ecosystem through this course of being eaten by the heterotrophs or other consumers. Primary consumers represent the next trophic level, and these are typically herbivores that eat the producers. But the primary consumers are also themselves consumed, specifically by secondary consumers that are carnivores or omnivores, and so on up through tertiary consumers and even quaternary consumers. So each of these levels represents a step in the food chain, which might be a more familiar concept to you. A food chain is a linear sequence of organisms through which nutrients and energy pass as one organism eats another. In the past, you may have seen food chains represented like this in a linear fashion, where one organism consumes another in these trophic levels. But in fact, a more informative representation of a food chain within an ecosystem is the pyramid shape. And that's because the pyramid shows you the relative abundance and amount of energy contained within each level of the food chain. Producers are the most abundant, and the largest amount of energy is also found in the producers. As we move up the pyramid at each trophic level, energy is lost as heat. Remember when we talked about the inefficiency of chemical reactions in a previous section? When I eat a hamburger, my body burns the chemical energy in that hamburger to provide for my functions. But those chemical reactions are leaky, and some of that chemical energy bleeds off as heat. Hence, why our bodies are warm. Now, if a bear comes along and eats me, she's not going to get all of the energy that was in the hamburger I ate because much of it has left my body and gone off into the environment as heat. That energy doesn't get transferred up the trophic pyramid to the bear who eats me. In fact, only about 10% of the total energy in a trophic level carries up to the next level because of this inefficiency. That's why the levels get smaller as you move up. It takes a lot of producers to support a smaller amount of primary consumers because the primary consumers can only derive a certain percentage of the producer's energy. It takes a lot of primary consumers to support an even smaller amount of secondary consumers, and so on. As you move up the levels, less energy becomes available, and organisms become less abundant as well. Another model that is used to represent the energy and consumption relationships in an ecosystem is a food web. Whereas a food chain is linear and steps up neatly one level to the next, a food web is more complex and shows multiple food chains that are interconnected with each other. In a food web, you are able to see how an organism can simultaneously play a role of a predator and prey. Here we see a side by side comparison of an Arctic ecosystem food chain on the left versus an Arctic ecosystem food web on the right. In the chain, we move from plankton, a type of algae, as the producers, to krill being the primary consumers, silverfish the secondary, leopard seal the tertiary, and orcas the quaternary. In the food web, we also see plankton and algae features as the producers, but we can see how they are consumed by multiple species from jellyfish to seabirds to cod, and we can see multiple organisms representing both predator and prey, such as the seal being a predator of polar cod, while also being prey to the polar bear and killer whale. So overall, the food web provides a more complete picture of the consumption of energy relationships in an ecosystem. One aspect of the complexity in an ecosystem's energy flow that we haven't addressed yet, though, is what happens to organisms after they die, because there are also organisms that derive their primary source of energy from dead organic material. And these decomposers, as they are called, play an important role in recycling the energy and the nutrients remaining in the biomass of a dead organism back into the ecosystem. Most decomposers are bacteria, fungi, and insects, and you can see some examples here. When a decomposer is an animal, there's a special term that we use for it. It's called a detritivore. So crabs, earthworms, lobsters, many types of beetles, flies, sea cucumbers, these are all detritivores. When we think about the relationship that detritivore have to a food web or a food chain, they are kind of off separately, doing their own thing. You'll often see them represented sort of distinctly from the rest of the relationships in the chain or web, because really they consume everything members of the ecosystem. They just do so after those members have died. So in these two examples, you can see the decomposers separated here, and everything else is funneling to them. These are actually considered two separate but interrelated food webs. The grazing food web is the one that is based upon the consumption of living organisms, and the detrital food web is based on the consumption of dead organisms. In any given ecosystem, you can see both of them at play. The last topic that we need to touch on is in this section, as we often do, is to talk about why this all matters. Why is it important to study food webs? One reason is that understanding food webs can give us a picture of the impact of human activity on an ecosystem. For example, as climate change causes the Arctic to warm, the sea ice to melt, algae that grow along the bottom surface of the sea ice are becoming threatened. These sea ice algae are producers in the ecosystem, occupying the lowest trophic level. They are eaten by krill, fish, plankton, which are in turn eaten by secondary consumers, and so on. So, challenges in the climate that threaten the producers are expected to cause a chain reaction to the consumers in the web that depend upon them, either directly or indirectly, for subsistence. Food webs also have practical purposes such as in agriculture. Because energy is just one of the components that flows through a food web, nutrients do as well, including nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfate, and others. Organisms need certain ratios of these nutrients to function, and the ratio relationship between them is known as stoichiometry. Farmers are especially concerned with this because crop plants need to obtain certain ratios of nutrients in order to successfully grow. This food web, for example, depicts the ecosystem of a rice paddy, including the rice plant and the microscopic organisms that inhabit the soil, including bacteria, protozoans, and microscopic worms called nematodes. This graphic was the result of an experiment where rice was grown under high CO2 and increased nitrogen fertilizer conditions, and the researchers sought to determine what impact this would have on the flow of nutrients through the rice paddy ecosystem. We have one more item to cover related to food webs and energy flow, and that is the concept of gross and net primary productivity, which are essentially measures of how much energy is flowing into the ecosystem via the producers. Gross primary productivity, or GPP, is defined as the rate at which photoautotrophs produce organic matter or energy from sunlight, carbon dioxide, and water per unit of land area per year. As you can imagine, gross primary productivity varies from ecosystem to ecosystem. A tropical rainforest has a higher gross primary productivity than a desert. This map of the continental United States shows the gross primary productivity of the land in different geographic areas, with brown represented in the lowest GPP and darker green and blue shades representing the highest. As you can see, the areas that we would recognize as being temperate and subtropical, like the West Coast and the Southeast, have the highest GPP, with the Intermountain West being the lowest. GPP is a useful measure when assessing how well a geographic region would be able to sustain agriculture or forestry. Another related useful measure of available energy is net primary productivity. Net primary productivity is gross primary productivity minus the energy needs of the producer. Because when autotrophs perform photosynthesis and create carbohydrates, they have to burn some of those carbohydrates to support their own function. So autotrophs actually perform cellular respiration too. And when they do, they typically use up about half of the energy they've converted through photosynthesis for their own purposes, leaving the other 50% available to be potentially consumed by consumers. So, NPP is useful for understanding how much energy there is to be derived from producers by consumers, such as ourselves.